There is something worth noticing about the way names work in history. A name is rarely just a label. It carries identity, association, and meaning. So when a name changes, quietly, without ceremony, without a clear public explanation, it is reasonable to pause and ask why. Name changes happen, of course. Institutions evolve. Organizations restructure. Families adopt new identities for any number of reasons. This is not unusual on its own. But there is a particular kind of name change that stands apart from the rest. It is the kind where the old name becomes difficult to find, where the records grow thin, where the silence around what came before feels less like absence and more like intention. In 1744, a name changed. That much the historical record confirms. The date is there. The fact of the change is acknowledged. But what the records do not offer, not clearly, not completely, is the reason. And that gap is worth examining, because a date without an explanation is not really documentation. It is simply a marker. Something happened here. Move forward. But the question of why that name was left behind, and what that name actually represented, is far less settled than the records might suggest. The official version exists. It always does. When institutions change their names, there is usually a formal account of why. A statement, a charter revision, a letter, some trace of reasoning that can be followed. And in this case, something like that exists. But when examined carefully, the official explanation feels incomplete. Not wrong necessarily, just insufficient, like an answer that was prepared without fully engaging with the question. The explanation accounts for the surface of the change, but not for what sits underneath it. And that distinction matters more than it might seem at first. This is where it becomes unclear. What was the name before 1744? Some historical sources mention it, briefly, and without much context. Others seem to step around it entirely, referencing the post-1744 identity as though nothing meaningful existed before it. That pattern of avoidance is itself a kind of information. In historical research, when something is consistently difficult to find, the reason is not always that it was lost. Archives are incomplete, yes. Records decay. Entire collections disappear over centuries. But there is a difference between information that was lost and information that was stepped away from. The former leaves scattered traces. The latter leaves a particular kind of quiet. Most routine name changes, the administrative kind, the procedural kind, leave documentation on both sides of the transition. What the name was, what it became, why the change was made at that specific moment. The paperwork tends to be straightforward, even mundane. What is notable about this particular case is how much of that surrounding documentation is absent. Not all of it, but enough that the change begins to feel less like a simple administrative update and more like a deliberate shift in identity. Something was being moved away from. Something about the original name, or what it represented, made the transition feel necessary. And that is the question that remains. If the name change was ordinary, the original name should be easy to find. It should appear in cross-references, in correspondence, in the kind of incidental mentions that fill historical archives. Instead, there is mostly silence, scattered references, a trail that grows faint quickly. Silence in history is rarely accidental. It tends to mean that something, at some point, was considered better left unexamined. What that something was, and why 1744 was the moment it was finally stepped away from, is a question the records have not yet fully answered. The accepted explanation for the 1744 name change is, on the surface, a reasonable one. Administrative restructuring, a formal recognition of a shifted purpose or identity. In the 18th century, this kind of thing happened with some regularity. Institutions grew. Merchant houses reorganized. Governing bodies redefined their own roles as political landscapes shifted around them. Name changes were part of that process. They reflected new realities, new affiliations, new directions. So when this particular change is first encountered in the historical record, it does not immediately stand out. It looks, at first glance, like one of many similar transitions from that era. Routine, expected, unremarkable. But that first impression does not hold for long. When an institution changes its name for administrative reasons, the paper trail tends to be clear. Charters are revised and reissued. Internal correspondence begins using the new name and sometimes references the old one in the same documents. Public-facing records reflect the transition. Even in the 18th century, when record-keeping was less systematic than it would later become, these kinds of changes left behind enough material to reconstruct a reasonable picture of what happened and why. The documentation may be imperfect, but it exists. It answers the basic questions. In this case, however, the documentation surrounding the 1744 change is surprisingly sparse. What survives is formal in appearance, but thin in detail. The change is recorded. The reasoning behind it is not. This is where it becomes unclear, because a name change without a clearly stated reason is not, by itself, suspicious. Reasons were not always committed to writing in that period, but when the absence of explanation is combined with the difficulty of tracing the original name, the picture begins to look less like incomplete record-keeping and more like something that was deliberately kept brief. There's a difference between documentation that was never created and documentation that was created but did not survive. The pattern here does not fit neatly into either category. It sits somewhere in between, and that ambiguity is part of what makes it difficult to dismiss. The timing raises its own questions. Why 1744 specifically? The mid-18th century was a period of significant movement, politically, economically, and in terms of how institutions presented themselves publicly. Some historians point to the broader shifts of that era as context for the change. Others connect it to internal reorganization, suggesting that something within the structure itself made a new name necessary or useful. Both explanations are plausible. Neither is entirely satisfying, because neither fully accounts for why this particular moment was chosen, or why the transition from the old name to the new one seems to have been handled with such minimal public acknowledgement. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Most institutions, when they change names, do not erase what came before. The old name remains visible in historical records and references, in the kind of incidental documentation that accumulates over time. Here, the old name is present, but only just. It appears in certain sources and is absent from others in a way that does not follow a clear pattern. That inconsistency is worth noting. It suggests that the visibility of the original name was, at some point, an active consideration rather than a passive outcome. Some believe the explanation is straightforward and that the gaps simply reflect the limitations of 18th century record-keeping. Others disagree and find the gaps too specific to be accidental. What both sides acknowledge, however, is that the documentation does not fully resolve the question. The official explanation accounts for the fact of the change. It does not account for the deliberate nature of it, and that distinction, small as it may seem, is where the doubt begins to settle in. When researchers look further back, past 1744, into the earlier decades of the 18th century, the picture that begins to form is noticeably different from the one the later records present. The entity that eventually changed its name did not arrive at that moment without a past. There was a history before it, structures that preceded it, affiliations that shaped it, purposes that defined it long before the name change formalized something new. That earlier history exists in the record, but only partially. It appears in fragments, in references that surface briefly and then disappear, in documents that acknowledge the earlier identity without ever fully explaining what that identity meant or how it connected to what came after. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Some documents from the early 1700s do reference the original name, but the way they reference it is itself worth noting. There is no explanation attached to these mentions, no clarification offered. The name appears as though it requires none, as though any reader of that time would already understand exactly what it referred to and what weight it carried. That kind of assumed familiarity is not typical of neutral or unremarkable labels. Ordinary administrative names tend to be referenced plainly and functionally. When a name is used without explanation, as though its meaning is already shared and understood, it usually means the name carried something beyond its surface. It meant something specific to the people using it. What that specific meaning was, however, is not clearly recorded anywhere that has been found. This raises a question that becomes harder to set aside the longer it is considered. If the pre-1744 identity was simply an earlier version of the same institution, a predecessor in name only, with the same basic structure and purpose continuing forward, then the absence of explanation would be less significant. Institutions reference their own histories regularly. They trace their lineage. They use longevity as evidence of credibility and stability. Most organizations that have existed for decades or centuries are willing, even eager, to acknowledge what came before. The earlier chapters of their story are treated as foundations, not as complications. But this is where it becomes unclear. In this case, 1744 functions in the record less like a milestone in a continuous history and more like a starting point. References to the pre-1744 period are uncommon in the later documentation. When they do appear, they tend to be brief and lacking in detail. The earlier identity is not celebrated. It is not traced. It is not held up as the origin of something that continued forward. Instead, it sits in the background of the record, present but not emphasized, acknowledged but not explored. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. There are two reasonable ways to interpret this pattern. The first is that the pre-1744 identity was genuinely distinct enough that those who came after did not feel a strong connection to it, that the name change represented a real break, not just a surface adjustment, and that the earlier history was simply less relevant to the new identity. The second interpretation is more specific, that the earlier history was considered better left at a distance, that something about what the original name represented made proximity to it inconvenient. Neither interpretation can be confirmed with what the current record provides. Both remain possibilities. What can be said is that the choice to treat 1744 as a kind of beginning, rather than as one point in a longer and more visible continuum, was a choice. Whether it was deliberate or gradual, conscious, or simply the result of how the institution chose to present itself over time, is a question the earlier records have not fully answered. The more closely this name change is examined, the more a pattern begins to take shape. And in historical research, patterns carry weight. A single gap in the record can be explained by the limitations of the era. A single missing document can be attributed to the natural deterioration of archives over centuries. But when the same kind of gap appears repeatedly, across different sources, across different time periods, across material that should not logically be connected, it becomes harder to explain through chance alone. The pattern here is not dramatic. It is quiet, but it is consistent. And consistency, in this context, is the part that is difficult to set aside. The pattern is one of selective visibility. Certain elements of the pre-1744 identity appear in the historical record without difficulty. They can be found, referenced, and traced. Other elements cannot. And this is where it becomes unclear, because the parts that are missing do not appear to be missing at random. They cluster around particular areas of inquiry. Questions about who held authority within the original structure. Questions about what external connections existed and with whom. Questions about what the institution's actual purpose was before the name changed. These are not peripheral details. They are the kind of information that would normally be well represented in any reasonable body of historical documentation. Their absence is notable. At first, it seems normal to attribute these gaps to the general unreliability of 18th century record-keeping. Archives from that period are incomplete. Documents were lost to fire, flood, neglect, and the ordinary passage of time. This is a legitimate explanation, and one that applies genuinely to a great deal of historical research from that era. The argument is reasonable on its surface. But there is a problem. Random loss tends to produce random gaps. It removes material without preference, correspondence here, a ledger there, a set of minutes from a particular meeting. What it does not typically produce is a consistent pattern of absence, focused on specific categories of information while leaving other categories relatively intact. However, the gaps here do not behave like random loss. They are focused. Researchers who have examined the available material closely note that the absences tend to align with questions about structure and connection. Affiliations that appear in pre-1744 documents seem to dissolve from the record after the name change, without explanation of how or why those relationships ended. Certain individuals who appear with some prominence in the earlier material are simply absent from the later record, not referenced, not mentioned in transition, not accounted for in any way that has been found. That kind of disappearance, repeated across multiple figures and multiple sources, is not easy to explain through archival misfortune alone. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because what it suggests, without confirming, is that the process surrounding the 1744 name change involved more than a simple administrative update. If the underlying structure had continued unchanged, the documentation on both sides of 1744 should reflect a reasonable degree of continuity. Personnel, affiliations, and stated purposes should remain broadly traceable. The fact that they do not, that the post-1744 record looks meaningfully different from what preceded it in ways that go beyond the name itself, points towards something more significant than a label revision. Some believe the gaps are the product of time and circumstance, nothing more. Others find them too concentrated, too specific in what they omit, to be accidental. Both positions are defensible with the available evidence. What neither position fully explains is why the missing information clusters so consistently around the same questions, and why those particular questions remain, after all this time, without clear answers. Several theories have been put forward to explain the 1744 name change, what it conceals, what it signals, and what it might mean for understanding the identity that existed before it. It is worth being clear at the outset. None of these theories has been confirmed. The available evidence does not settle the question in favor of any single explanation. What the theories offer instead is a set of possible frameworks, different ways of making sense of the same incomplete picture. Each one accounts for some of what the record shows. None of them accounts for all of it. And that gap between what each theory explains and what it leaves unresolved is itself part of what keeps this question open. The first theory is built around the idea of protection. In the mid-18th century, political climates across Europe were shifting in ways that made certain associations uncomfortable or even dangerous. Institutions with connections to particular networks, allegiances, or traditions sometimes found it necessary to create distance between themselves and those associations, not by abandoning their actual purpose, but by changing how they presented themselves publicly. A new name, in this context, would function as a kind of shield, a way of continuing without drawing attention. This theory has a reasonable logic to it, but it raises its own question. If the name change was protective, what specifically was being protected against? The record does not say. And without that detail, the theory remains plausible but unanchored. The second theory moves in a different direction entirely. Rather than concealment, it proposes deliberate reinvention. A new name not as a way of hiding something, but as a way of signaling something. A shift in purpose, a change in allegiance, a conscious decision to become something different and to mark that difference publicly through a new identity. This interpretation treats the name change as a declaration rather than a defense. At first, it seems like a cleaner explanation, one that requires less to be hidden and more to be announced. But there's a problem. If the change was meant as a public signal, the usual expectation would be some accompanying communication, some record of what was being declared and to whom. That kind of documentation is largely absent here, which makes the reinvention theory difficult to fully support. The third theory is the most straightforward. It suggests that the significance being assigned to this name change is, at least in part, a consequence of incomplete records. That if the full body of documentation from that period were available, correspondence, internal records, administrative filings, the change would appear far more routine than it currently does. The gaps would be filled. The pattern of selective visibility would dissolve into ordinary archival variation. This explanation is genuinely possible. Incomplete records have produced false impressions of significance before. However, the timeline does not fully match what this theory requires. The specific nature of the gaps, their focus on particular categories of information, makes a simple archival explanation harder to sustain without additional evidence. Most researchers who have examined this question acknowledge that the available material does not firmly support any one of these positions. Each theory fits part of the picture. Each one leaves something unexplained. And the honest position, given what currently exists in the record, is one of uncertainty rather than conclusion. That is where this investigation rests. Not at an answer, at a series of questions surrounding a specific date, a name that became difficult to trace, and a silence in the historical record that has never been fully accounted for. What existed before 1744, what it represented, and why it remains so difficult to see clearly? These are questions the record has raised, but not resolved.